If you grew up anywhere in America between the 1950s and 1980s, chances are you have memories of that chubby kid in the checkered overalls holding a hamburger high above his head. Shoney's Big Boy wasn't just a restaurant, it was a cultural institution where families gathered after church, where teenagers went on first dates, and where that breakfast bar seemed to stretch on forever. But behind those iconic statues and those double-decker burgers were some truly bizarre stories that most people never knew about. From stolen statues to lost recipes to a messy corporate divorce, the history of Shoney's Big Boy is way stranger than you'd ever imagine. Fact 1, the Big Boy wasn't originally Big Boy.
Hi, I'm Big Boy. Here's a good hot breakfast to start your day.
When you think of Shoney's Big Boy, the first image that probably comes to mind is that round-cheeked mascot with the pompadour and red and white checkered overalls. He's cheerful, iconic, and instantly recognizable. But here's the twist. Big Boy didn't actually start at Shoney's. In fact, Shoney's didn't exist at all when the character first appeared in 1936. The original Big Boy restaurant was opened by Bob Weon in Glendale, California. Weon had sold his car to buy a tiny hamburger stand for just $350, a risky investment at the time. He needed something special to draw customers, and what he created was a double-decker hamburger that quickly became a sensation. Only later, when the restaurant had gained popularity, did the familiar chubby mascot make his debut, inspired by a real-life child who frequented the stand. Shoney's Big Boy didn't enter the picture until 1947, when Alex Schonbaum opened his first restaurant in Charleston, West Virginia, under a licensing agreement with Weon. Schonbaum built his own regional chain, eventually expanding throughout the South, while paying fees to use the Big Boy name and mascot. Around the same time, other regional chains were sprouting up. Bob's Big Boy in California, Frisch's in the Midwest, and Elias Brothers in Michigan, among others. Each chain operated independently, sharing a menu style and mascot, but managing their own restaurants, finances, and expansions. This unusual system, where multiple companies coexisted under a single brand, worked for decades, giving Americans across the country a familiar image and menu, despite regional differences. But by the 1980s, the complexities of shared branding and franchise agreements would lead to major legal battles and corporate shakeups, with Shoney's eventually breaking away entirely to establish its own identity. Fact 2, that iconic statue was based on a real kid. Every Shoney's Big Boy featured that giant fiberglass statue out front. And if you were a kid in the 1960s or 70s, you probably begged your parents to let you climb on it before going inside. It was an irresistible part of the experience, but the story behind the character is even more surprising. Big Boy was actually modeled after a real child. In 1936, a chubby 6-year-old named Richard Woodruff wandered into Bob Wyon's hamburger stand in Glendale, California. With his slicked-back pompadour and his eyes barely reaching over the counter, Weon greeted him warmly, saying, "Hello there, Big Boy." The nickname stuck, leaving a lasting impression on Weon. A few years later, when Weon needed a mascot for his increasingly popular double-decker hamburger, he remembered young Richard and asked a cartoonist to create a character based on him. The sketch included the pompadour, overalls, and eventually the signature checkered pattern, creating an image that would become instantly recognizable across America. Richard Woodruff never profited financially from being the inspiration for Big Boy, though he was granted free burgers for life at the original restaurant. Despite his indirect fame, he led a quiet, ordinary life, rarely speaking about the iconic character he inspired. Yet his likeness lives on, immortalized in the mascot that became synonymous with family dining, and one of the most enduring images in American restaurant history. Fact 3, Big Boy started as a 10-cent hamburger stand. It's hard to believe, but the empire that became Shoney's Big Boy started with hamburgers that cost just 10 cents. In 1936, Bob Wyan opened a tiny hamburger stand in Glendale, California, so small that only he and one employee could work behind the counter. With a handful of stools and no dining room, it served working-class customers seeking a quick, affordable meal. Wyan worked 7 days a week, opening early and closing late, doing everything he could to make the stand successful. The turning point came when regular customers asked for something bigger. Wyan responded by stacking 2 beef patties on a 3-layer bun with cheese, lettuce, and his special sauce, charging 15 cents for this new creation. The double-decker burger became an instant hit, earning the name Big Boy and transforming Wyan's modest stand into a sensation. Expansion followed quickly. By the late 1940s, Wyan began licensing the Big Boy name across the country. One of his earliest licensees was Alex Schonbaum, whose Shoney's chain in the South would eventually grow into the most successful regional Big Boy operation. From a humble 10-cent hamburger to a nationwide franchise system, the Big Boy Burger laid the foundation for a major American restaurant legacy. Fact 4. The name came from an actual customer. The story behind the Big Boy name is almost too perfect to be true, yet it's well documented. In 1936, Bob Wien greeted a chubby 6-year-old named Richard Woodruff with a cheerful, "Hello there, big boy." Wien wasn't thinking about creating a brand. He just wanted to make the child feel special. But the nickname stuck. When Wien later developed his double-decker hamburger, he named it the Big Boy Burger in honor of Richard, giving the meal an identity that was both friendly and memorable. The name worked on multiple levels. It suggested a hearty, satisfying meal while sounding approachable, like a dad's nickname for his son or a playful tease from a friend. When Alex Schonbaum licensed the Big Boy name in 1947, he put his own spin on it, calling his restaurants Shoney's Big Boy after his personal nickname. Over time, the full name became iconic throughout the South, though most patrons simply called it Shoney's. The name became more than a brand. It became a familiar, comforting presence in the region's dining landscape. Fact 5. Shoney's and Big Boy had a messy divorce. Things got truly dramatic in 1984, when Shoney's and Big Boy went through a messy corporate divorce. For decades, Shoney's had operated as a Big Boy franchise, paying fees to use the name and mascot while running its own regional chain. By the 1980s, however, Shoney's had grown so large and profitable that executives began to resent sending a portion of their earnings to Big Boy headquarters in Michigan. They decided the company could thrive on its own and made the bold move to break away entirely. The split was far from amicable. Big Boy sued Shoney's, sparking years of legal battles over branding rights, locations, and franchise agreements. When the dust settled, Shoney's was required to remove all Big Boy branding, the iconic statues, the famous double-decker burger, and even the name itself. The chain faced the challenge of reinventing its identity, a risky undertaking given how closely its image had been tied to Big Boy for decades. Despite the upheaval, Shoney's pressed on, expanding throughout the South during the late 1980s and into the 1990s. While the chain remained successful, some longtime customers mourned the loss of the original Big Boy experience, feeling that a beloved piece of nostalgia had vanished along with the mascot and the branding they had grown up with. Fact 6. The secret sauce recipe has been lost and found multiple times. Every great burger joint has a secret sauce, and Big Boy was no exception. That creamy, tangy sauce on the original double-decker burger was as iconic as the statue out front. But the recipe has a strange history. It's been lost and rediscovered multiple times. Bob Wien created the sauce in the 1930s and kept it tightly guarded, mixing batches himself with only a few trusted employees knowing the ingredients. As Big Boy expanded across the country, each regional chain, Shoney's, Bob's, Frisch's, made its own version, and over time, the recipes began to drip. By the 1970s, during corporate changes, the original written recipe reportedly disappeared. Food scientists had to reverse engineer it, producing something close but not exactly the same. The same thing happened again in the 1990s with another ownership change. Regulars noticed the difference over the decades. The same secret sauce subtly evolved with every generation. Fact 7. Big Boy comics were legitimate collectibles. Here's something kids today might never know. Big Boy restaurants used to give out free comic books. Starting in 1956, the adventures of Big Boy comics featured Big Boy, his girlfriend Dolly, and his dog Nugget on wholesome adventures. Professionally drawn and written, these comics were far more than a simple promo. They were collectible stories that kids loved. Comics cost 10-15 cents in the 1950s, so getting one free with a meal was a big deal. Children collected, traded, and eagerly awaited the next issue. Over 450 issues were produced between 1956 and 1996, sometimes featuring celebrity cameos or current events. Early issues in good condition are now worth hundreds of dollars. For kids visiting Shoney's in the 1960s or 70s, the comics were almost as exciting as the meal itself. They were discontinued in 1996 as financial pressures forced Big Boy and its franchises to cut costs, ending a beloved 40-year tradition. Fact 8. The breakfast bar was ahead of its time. Long before breakfast buffets were common, Shoney's Big Boy introduced the all-you-can-eat breakfast bar in the 1970s, a concept that would become a signature feature. It wasn't just eggs and bacon. Guests could choose from multiple egg dishes, various breakfast meats, pancakes or waffles with toppings, fresh fruit, pastries, cereals, and more. For a fixed price, diners could fill their plates as many times as they liked. At a time when most restaurants relied on on table service, the self-serve concept was novel. Shoney's even had signs explaining that customers could return for seconds or thirds. Families flocked on weekends, strategically piling plates with everything from eggs and meat to chocolate chip pancakes and biscuits and gravy. The breakfast bar became so popular that it turned Shoney's into a morning destination and inspired other chains to adopt similar buffets. By the 1990s, breakfast bars were everywhere, but Shoney's had been pioneering the idea for decades. Fact 9. Bob's Big Boy and Shoney's Big Boy were cousins, not twins. The Big Boy franchise system was surprisingly complicated. Bob's Big Boy in California and Shoney's Big Boy in the South shared the same mascot and similar menus, but they were completely separate companies, more like cousins than twins. Bob Wien started the original Bob's Big Boy in the 1930s, eventually expanding across the West. These restaurants had distinctive mid-century architecture, including the famous Googie-style location in Burbank. Shoney's, started by Alex Schoenbaum in West Virginia in 1947 under license from Wien, built its own chain across the South. Other regional chains included Frisch's in the Midwest and Elias Brothers in Michigan. Each was independent, paying licensing fees for the name and mascot, but operating on its own. The result? Subtle differences in menu, taste, and decor between regions. Even though all were Big Boy, the system worked for decades, but eventually became unsustainable, culminating in Shoney's dramatic 1984 split from Big Boy. Fact 10. The strawberry pie had a cult following. Of all Shoney's Big Boy desserts, none inspired more devotion than the strawberry pie. Regulars in the 1970s and 80s knew it well. Either they loved it or they knew someone who did. The pie was simple: a graham cracker crust filled with fresh strawberries in a sweet gelatinous sauce and topped with whipped cream. Yet the combination of crunchy crust, juicy berries, and just the right sweetness made it irresistible. Some fans came to Shoney's solely for the pie, asking waitresses, "Is the strawberry pie fresh today?" before even glancing at the menu. When strawberries were in season, the pie was at its peak, bursting with flavor. Off-season pies use frozen berries, which true devotees could tell. Countless home cooks have tried to recreate it, but few capture the same magic. Even today, fans will drive miles to a Shoney's just to order that iconic strawberry pie. Fact 11. Big Boy restaurants used to close on Sundays. Believe it or not, many Big Boy restaurants, including numerous Shoney's locations, used to be closed on Sundays. In mid-20th century America, especially in the South, Sunday was considered a day of rest and worship, and owners didn't want employees working on the Lord's Day. For customers, this made Saturday the busiest day of the week. Families often visited after baseball games or for dinner. Packing the restaurants since Sunday wasn't an option. By the 1970s and 80s, competition and changing attitudes pushed Shoney's to open on Sundays, often with limited hours at first. The shift wasn't without controversy. Some small-town customers protested, writing letters or even boycotting. Employees debated too. Some valued the day off, while others wanted the extra hours and tips. Over time, Sunday became just another shift, but the old policy remains a quirky reminder of how much culture shaped business decisions in that era. Fact 12. The uniforms were surprisingly strict. If you ever worked at Shoney's Big Boy, you know the uniform rules were strict. This wasn't a casual t-shirt situation. Employees had to follow precise guidelines, and managers enforced them rigorously. Waitresses wore specific dresses or jumpers in the restaurant's colors with white aprons. Dresses had to be the right length. Pantyhose were required even in summer. Shoes spotless, hair pulled back, and jewelry minimal. Male employees had their own rules. Cooks and dishwashers wore clean, pressed all-white uniforms, while hosts and managers wore dress shirts, slacks, and properly knotted ties. Hair and facial hair were tightly regulated. The goal was a consistent professional image across every location. Managers performed uniform inspections before shifts, sending staff home if anything was out of compliance. Employees sometimes bent the rules subtly, colorful laces or offbeat pantyhose, to maintain a bit of individuality. But overall, meeting Shoney's standards was non-negotiable. Fact 13. Shoney's had its own record label. Here's a weird fact that hardly anyone remembers. Shoney's briefly operated its own record label in the 1980s, releasing albums of family-friendly country and pop music that were sold in their restaurants. The whole venture was as strange as it sounds, but it actually made sense in the context of the times. The idea was that Shoney's could create and sell music that aligned with their family-friendly brand image. The albums featured cover songs of popular hits, performed by studio musicians in a style that would appeal to Shoney's core customer base: families, older folks, and people in the South. They'd sell these albums at the cashier's counter for a few dollars, and customers could take home a souvenir of their Shoney's experience. The quality of these recordings was actually pretty good. Shoney's hired competent session musicians and used decent studios. They weren't trying to compete with major label releases, but they weren't putting out garbage either. The albums typically featured a mix of current country hits, classic pop standards, and sometimes gospel music, all given a safe, radio-friendly treatment. For a brief period in the mid-1980s, you'd walk up to the cashier at Shoney's and see a small display of albums and cassette tapes right next to the mints and toothpicks. Titles would be things like Country Favorites or Golden Oldies or Family Gospel Hour. Some people actually bought these albums, especially older customers who appreciated having a collection of familiar songs, performed in an unoffensive style. The record label venture didn't last long. By the late 1980s, the music industry was changing rapidly, with CDs replacing vinyl and cassettes, and tastes were shifting in ways that made Shoney's wholesome cover albums seem increasingly out of touch. The company quietly discontinued the record label, and most of the albums they produced were probably thrown away or ended up in thrift stores. If you still have one of those Shoney's record label albums sitting around somewhere, hold on to it. They're not worth a fortune, but they're definitely a weird piece of Americana that captures a very specific moment in restaurant and music history. Fact 14: the hot fudge cake was a scientific achievement.
Today I'm making a hot fudge cake which is oozy, saucy, fudgy and most chocolatey ever.
Shoney's hot fudge cake deserves its own place in the Dessert Hall of Fame. This wasn't just a good dessert, it was an engineering marvel that somehow combined cake, ice cream, and hot fudge in a way that actually worked when you think about it. Logically shouldn't have. The hot fudge cake consisted of a brownie-like chocolate cake that was somehow still warm, topped with a scoop of vanilla ice cream, covered with hot fudge sauce, and finished with whipped cream and a cherry. The genius was in the temperature contrast and the way all the elements held together on the plate without immediately melting into a puddle. The secret was in the cake itself, which was dense and sturdy enough to provide a stable base even when topped with cold ice cream and hot fudge. The cake would be heated just before serving, but not so hot that it would instantly melt the ice cream. The hot fudge would be kept at a very specific temperature that was hot enough to stay liquid and flavorful, but not so hot that it would turn the ice cream into soup. Timing was everything. A good server knew exactly when to assemble the hot fudge cake so that it would arrive at your table in optimal condition, with the ice cream still mostly frozen, the cake still warm, and the fudge still liquid. If you waited too long to dig in, you'd end up with a soupy mess, but if you ate it right away, you got to experience this perfect combination of temperatures and textures. The hot fudge cake became one of Shoney's signature desserts, and people who grew up going there still talk about it with reverence. It was the kind of dessert that was worth saving room for. Even if you were stuffed from the breakfast bar or a big burger meal, kids would beg for it, and adults would pretend they were only ordering it for the kids while secretly planning to eat most of it themselves. If you worked at Shoney's as a server, you learned quickly that the hot fudge cake was your friend. It had a high profit margin, customers loved it, and it was impressive enough that it often led to better tips. Smart servers would talk it up when taking dessert orders, and they'd make sure to deliver it with a flourish that made the whole table take notice. Fact 15: big boy statues were frequently stolen by college kids.
You know, Bob loves kids and kids love Bob. Just ask anyone.
Those massive fiberglass big boy statues that stood outside every restaurant weren't just beloved mascots. They were also frequent targets for theft, particularly by college students pulling pranks. The phenomenon of big boy statue theft became so common in the 1970s and 80s that restaurants had to take special security measures to protect them. The statues typically weighed a few hundred pounds and stood 6 to 7 feet tall, so stealing one required planning and multiple people. The classic prank involved a group of fraternity brothers or dorm mates showing up late at night with a truck, working together to lift the statue off its mounting and hauling it away to display in a fraternity house, dorm room, or apartment as a trophy. Some colleges developed legendary rivalries over big boy statue theft. Schools would steal statues from restaurants in rival college towns, leading to back and forth thefts that sometimes lasted for years. The statues would show up in the strangest places, on top of dorm buildings, in the middle of campus quads, even at football games where they'd be displayed in the student section. Restaurant owners were not amused by this tradition. Those statues were expensive to replace, and having your big boy statue stolen was bad for business. Customers would show up expecting to see the familiar mascot and find an empty pedestal. Instead, restaurants started bolting the statues down more securely, installing lights and cameras around them, and even setting up alarms that would go off if the statue was moved. The police usually treated big boy statue theft as a prank rather than serious crime, which frustrated restaurant owners owners, but didn't stop the practice. Most stolen statues were eventually returned, usually anonymously dropped off in the parking lot after the prank had run its course. Occasionally, though, a statue would disappear permanently, presumably destined to become a permanent fixture in someone's basement or backyard. If you were in college during the 1970s or 80s, you probably knew someone who had either stolen a Big Boy statue or knew someone who had. It was one of those things that was talked about in hushed tones, a rite of passage for a certain type of student. Today, with increased security and harsher penalties for theft, Big Boy statue stealing is much less common, but the legends of the great statue heists live on. Fact 16. The fish and chips were originally the main attraction.
And of something even more typically British, if that's possible. Fish and chips. Churchill called them the good companions.
Before the double-decker burger became synonymous with Big Boy, the restaurants were actually built on the popularity of their fish and chips. This is a fact that surprises most people who associate Big Boy exclusively with hamburgers. But in the early days, particularly at many Shoney's locations, fish and chips were what brought people through the door. Alex Schoenbaum, who founded Shoney's, had spent time studying successful restaurant concepts before opening his first Big Boy franchise in 1947. He noticed that fish and chips were hugely popular in certain markets, especially among working-class customers who wanted a filling, affordable meal. When he opened his first Shoney's Big Boy in Charleston, West Virginia, he made fish and chips a centerpiece of the menu alongside the Big Boy burger. The fish was always fresh, never frozen, and it was hand-battered before being fried to a golden crisp. The chips, which Americans would call fries, were thick-cut and seasoned just right. The whole meal came with coleslaw and hush puppies, making it a substantial dinner that cost less than most other sit-down restaurant meals of the era. On Fridays during Lent, when Catholics weren't supposed to eat meat, Shoney's Big Boy restaurants would be absolutely packed with people ordering fish and chips. What's interesting is that different regional Big Boy chains emphasize different menu items. While Shoney's in the South was known for fish and chips, Frisch's Big Boy in the Midwest was more famous for their tartar sauce, and Bob's Big Boy in California focused primarily on burgers. This regional variation was part of what made the Big Boy franchise system both interesting and complicated. By the 1970s, the emphasis at Shoney's had shifted more toward burgers, breakfast items, and their famous salad bar, but the fish and chips never disappeared from the menu. Older customers who had been going to Shoney's since the early days remained loyal to the fish and chips, and you could always find someone in the restaurant on Friday night working their way through a plate of that crispy fried fish. If your family went to Shoney's regularly in the 1960s or 70s, you probably remember your dad ordering the fish and chips while you got a burger. The fish and chips represented the old school Shoney's, the one that was focused on providing good, affordable meals to working families, before it became more about the breakfast bar and casual dining experience. Fact 17. Shoney's pioneered the salad bar concept. While we've already talked about the breakfast bar, Shoney's also deserves credit for being one of the first major restaurant chains to offer an all-you-can-eat salad bar for lunch and dinner. This wasn't just a side option, it was a full meal deal that revolutionized how Americans thought about eating vegetables at restaurants. The salad bar concept started appearing at Shoney's locations in the early 1980s, and it was much more elaborate than what you'd find at most restaurants today. This wasn't just iceberg lettuce with a few token vegetables. Shoney's salad bars featured multiple types of lettuce, dozens of fresh vegetables, pasta salads, fruit salads, soup, breadsticks, and more. It was basically an entire meal disguised as a salad bar. What made Shoney's salad bar special was the variety and the fact that everything was kept fresh and well stocked throughout the day. There were employees whose entire job was to maintain the salad bar, constantly refilling items, cleaning up spills, and making sure everything looked appetizing. The bread that came with the salad bar was baked fresh daily, and that alone was worth the price of admission. The salad bar became especially popular among business people who wanted a quick, relatively healthy lunch. You could get in and out of Shoney's in 30 minutes, fill up on salad and bread, and get back to work without feeling weighed down by a heavy meal. It was also popular with dieters who appreciated having so many vegetable options, though the salad dressings and pasta salads probably negated any caloric benefits. For kids, the salad bar was an adventure. Parents would send their children up to build their own salad, hoping to get them to eat some vegetables. Smart kids quickly figured out that the salad bar also included things like croutons, cheese, bacon bits, and sometimes even pudding or jello hidden among the vegetables. You could construct what was technically a salad, but was really more like a snack plate of all your favorite toppings. toppings. The peak years for Shoney's salad bar were probably the mid-1980s through the early 1990s, when the restaurant chain was at its most successful and profitable. As Shoney's started to decline in the late 1990s and 2000s, the salad bars became less impressive, with fewer options and less careful maintenance. But for a solid decade, Shoney's had one of the best salad bars in the family restaurant business. Fact 18. The coffee was surprisingly controversial. Of all the things to generate controversy at a family restaurant, you wouldn't expect coffee to be one of them. But Shoney's coffee became a surprisingly divisive topic among customers, with people falling into two distinct camps: those who thought it was terrible and those who were absolutely devoted to it. The coffee at Shoney's was strong, really strong. This wasn't the mild, smooth coffee that you'd get at a fancy coffee shop. This was working man's coffee, the kind that could wake you up from a coma and possibly remove paint from your car. It was served piping hot in thick ceramic mugs, and refills were free and frequent. Servers would walk around with coffee pots, topping off cups without even asking. The people who loved Shoney's coffee loved it for exactly the reasons others hated it. It was powerful, it had flavor, and it kept you alert. Truck drivers, factory workers, and people working early morning shifts swore by Shoney's coffee. They'd come in before dawn, order the breakfast bar, and drink cup after cup of that strong coffee to gear up for their day. For these customers, weak coffee was an insult, and Shoney's delivered exactly what they wanted. On the other hand, people who preferred milder coffee thought Shoney's coffee was undrinkable. They'd take one sip, wince, and immediately start adding cream and sugar to try to cut the bitterness. Some customers would specifically request weak coffee, or ask the server to add hot water to their cup to dilute it. Waitresses got used to people sending back their coffee, asking for tea instead. The controversy extended to how the coffee was made. Shoney's used commercial coffee makers that brewed large quantities at once, and the coffee would often sit on the burner for extended periods, getting stronger and more bitter as it cooked down. Some locations were better than others about brewing fresh pots regularly, which meant your coffee experience could vary significantly depending on when you visited and who was managing the coffee station that day. If you worked at Shoney's, you had to develop your own relationship with the coffee. Some employees loved it and would drink it throughout their shifts to stay energized. Others wouldn't touch it and would bring their own drinks from home. The coffee also became a test of sorts for new hires. If you could handle Shoney's coffee, you were tough enough to handle the job. Fact 19. Big Boy had international locations. You'd never expect. While most Americans think of Big Boy as a thoroughly American institution, the franchise actually spread to some surprising international locations over the decades. The most successful and long-lasting international Big Boy presence was in Japan, where the chain became hugely popular and remains in business today. Big Boy arrived in Japan in 1977, and it immediately clicked with Japanese consumers who were fascinated by American culture and cuisine. The Japanese Big Boy restaurants kept the iconic mascot and the double-decker burger concept, but they adapted the menu significantly to local tastes. You could get a traditional Big Boy burger, but you could also order items like teriyaki burgers, rice bowls, and Japanese-style curry. The restaurants were kept spotlessly clean and maintained a level of service that impressed even by Japanese standards. What's remarkable is that Big Boy became more successful and more enduring in Japan than it did in most of America. While Big Boy restaurants were closing left and right in the United States during the 1990s and 2000s, the Japanese locations were thriving. Today, there are more Big Boy restaurants in Japan than there are in the United States, which seems almost impossible given that it's an American brand. There were also Big Boy locations in other international markets over the years, though most didn't last as long as the Japanese ones. Thailand had several Big Boy restaurants at one point, and there were locations in various Middle Eastern countries. Each market tried to adapt the Big Boy concept to local tastes and preferences with varying degrees of success. The international presence of Big Boy created some surreal situations. American tourists traveling in Japan would stumble upon a Big Boy restaurant and have a moment of confusion. Was this the same Big Boy they knew from back home? Sort of, but also not really. The mascot was the same, the name was the same, but everything else had been adapted to fit Japanese culture. It was like looking at a familiar face through a funhouse mirror. If you ever visited a Big Boy restaurant in Japan, you'd notice that while the basic concept was recognizable, the execution was distinctly Japanese. The restaurants were smaller and more efficiently designed. The menu was more extensive and more focused on set meals rather than individual items. The service was incredibly attentive, with servers checking on you constantly. It was Big Boy, but filtered through an entirely different cultural lens. Fact 20. The original Big Boy building is now a museum. The original Bob's Big Boy restaurant in Burbank, California, which opened in 1949, is still standing today and has been designated as a California historical landmark. The building, with its distinctive Googie-style architecture and neon sign, represents a crucial piece of mid-century American restaurant history. The Burbank Bob's Big Boy is one of the oldest remaining examples of Googie architecture, that space-age, futuristic style that was popular in the 1950s and 60s for coffee shops, gas stations, and restaurants. The building features upswept roofs, geometric shapes, and large windows, all designed to catch the eye of passing motorists. At night, the neon sign would light up, and you could see it from blocks away, beckoning hungry travelers to come in for a Big Boy burger. What makes this location special is that it's not just a museum piece sitting empty. The restaurant is still operational, serving actual customers who can sit in the same booths where people sat in 1949. You can order the same double-decker Big Boy burger that Bob Wien invented, prepared according to the original recipe. It's like stepping into a time machine, except you can actually eat the food. The restaurant has become a pilgrimage site for classic car enthusiasts who gather there regularly for car shows and cruise nights. On Friday nights, the parking lot fills up with vintage automobiles from the 1950s and 60s, with their owners showing off their lovingly restored rides while eating Big Boy burgers. The combination of the historic building, the classic cars, and the original menu items creates an atmosphere that can't be replicated anywhere else. Historic preservationists fought hard to save the Burbank Bob's Big Boy when there were plans to demolish it in the 1990s. They argued correctly that this building represented an important piece of American cultural history. It wasn't just about preserving a restaurant, it was about preserving a way of life, a moment in time when families would pile into the car and drive to the local Big Boy for dinner. If you've never been to the Burbank Bob's Big Boy, it's worth a visit if you're ever in Southern California. Walking into that building is like walking into 1949. Yes, there have been updates and renovations over the years, but the essential character of the place remains intact. You can sit in a booth, order a Big Boy burger and a strawberry pie, and imagine what it must have been like when this was the cutting edge of restaurant design, and this type of dining experience was brand new and exciting. The survival of the original Bob's Big Boy building, while so many other Big Boy and Shoney's locations have closed and been demolished, is bittersweet. It's wonderful that we have this tangible connection to the past, this physical reminder of what these restaurants meant to generations of Americans. But it also highlights how much has been lost. For every Bob's Big Boy that's been preserved, there are dozens of Shoney's Big Boy locations that have been torn down and replaced with strip malls or parking lots. The story of Shoney's Big Boy and the larger Big Boy franchise is really a story about America itself during the second half of the 20th century. These weren't just places to eat. They were gathering spots where families celebrated birthdays, teenagers went on dates, business people held meetings, and communities came together, all under the familiar sight of that chubby kid in checkered overalls holding a hamburger, a symbol of something consistent and reliable in a rapidly changing world. From 10-cent hamburgers in 1936 to elaborate breakfast bars in the 1980s, from free comic books to stolen statues, from messy corporate divorces to surprising international success, the Big Boy timeline has more twists and turns than anyone would expect. And while some facts may seem weird or unbelievable, they're all part of the rich, strange history of an American institution. If you grew up going to Shoney's Big Boy, you probably have your own memories. The taste of the strawberry pie, the thrill of a third plate at the breakfast bar, or the excitement of a new Big